Tier 3 clearance means Tier 3 access, airmen. Nothing above the yellow line without a badge that says so. Captain Darcy Northcott said it the way she said most things near the ceremony staging, pitched for anyone within 30 feet, though her eyes stayed fixed on the gray-coveralled man pushing a mop bucket along the perimeter fence. That includes contractors. That includes him. Every evening, before he clocks out, the janitor stops at a padlocked door nobody has opened in years and rests his hand flat against it. Nobody on the walkway that afternoon knew that yet. What they knew was smaller, and they assumed complete. A man in his 70s wringing gray water out of a mop head 20 feet from where a 3-star general's motorcade would park in 5 days. A man with no badge tier, no clearance color, and by Captain Northcott's read of the perimeter list, no business being anywhere near the north span footbridge's freshly repainted railings. 6 years he had pushed that cart across this base, one door he had never once let himself open, and in 5 days, a 3-star general would hold that same door for him, though not one person watching Darcy Northcott recite policy at a 21-year-old airman had any way of knowing it yet. He's not on the list because he's not staff, Airman Maddox Jurgen said, glancing sideways at the old man, who had not looked up from his bucket. He's contractor janitorial. Floyd's been here since before I was stationed here. Then Floyd knows the badge policy better than you do, which makes this worse, not better. Northcott did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The ceremony staging behind her carried sound the way a shell carries an ocean, flat and metallic and far. She tapped the laminated card clipped to her belt loop, the one that listed the color tiers in order, and did not look at it, because she had recited this order perhaps 400 times since she'd inherited the policy from a facilities officer 2 postings before her. Yellow line is dignitary approach. Anyone without a badge tier gets moved to green or off-site entirely. I don't care how long he's swept this floor. Floyd Kirkendall wrung the mop head one more turn, hung it over the bucket's lip, and wheeled the cart 6 feet to the left, out past a strip of blue tape someone had laid that morning. He did this without a word. The way a man moves furniture he has moved 100 times before. No protest in his shoulders, no delay in his feet. A gray coverall, pressed sharp enough to hold a crease at the knee. A patch on the breast that read, Merrow Field Facilities Contract in thread, gone slightly pale from washing. If you've ever been the one nobody thought to ask, you already know what's coming. He did not look at Northcott. He looked, for exactly as long as it took to reposition the cart toward the far end of the flight line, where a low cinder block shed sat behind a chain-link gate nobody had opened in longer than the captain had been alive. Then he went back to his mop, and the moment closed over itself like water. Jurgen watched him go. He would think about that look more than once, in the days that followed, turning it over the way a man turns over a coin he suspects is worth more than its date suggests, without yet being able to say why. Northcott did not watch him at all. She had already moved on to the next line on her clipboard, the next name that needed checking against the next color, because in 5 days, a general's motorcade would roll through that gate, and every detail before that hour was, in her accounting, a number to be closed out and forgotten. Floyd's coveralls fit him the way a uniform fits a man who has worn one, pressed at the seams despite the trade, the cuffs turned back exactly 1 fold at each wrist. He carried his right shoulder lower than his left, not from injury exactly, more from a boundary his body had drawn and would not cross. When he reached for anything above chest height, he turned his whole trunk toward it, rather than lift the arm, a rotation so practiced it looked like courtesy rather than limitation. He was 74 years old, and the base had employed him as a contractor for 6 of those years, and in that time no one had asked him a single question about the other 68. His route each evening followed the same order: the hangar floor, the terminal corridor, the flight line restrooms, and last, always last, the stretch of cracked tarmac that ran behind the old maintenance shed at the near end of the north span footbridge, a squat building with one window boarded in plywood gone silver with age, and a padlock rusted to the color of dried blood. He would park the cart 8 feet short of the door. He would walk the remaining distance alone, without the mop, without the bucket. He would set his palm flat against the door's cold steel, hold it there for the length of one slow breath, and then walk back to the cart as though nothing at all had happened. In his breast pocket, riding against his sternum through every shift, was a notch gauge no longer than a pocket knife, hand-filed from a strip of tool steel, its edges worn smooth by a thumb that had checked it 10,000 times. Stamped into its flat was a set of initials that matched no name on any current base directory. FAK, cut deep enough that 60 years of handling had not worn them shallow. It measured weld gaps to a tolerance finer than most current instruments bothered with, a thing built by a man's own hand for a trade that had, by every account the base kept, retired with him. He never explained the gauge to anyone who asked, and in 6 years, exactly 2 people had asked. He never explained the door either. Some nights Jurgen, doing his own closing rounds, caught the shape of him standing there in the sodium light, hand flat, head bowed slightly, and assumed it was rest, an old man catching his breath before the walk to his truck. It was, in fact, the one moment of Floyd Kirkendall's day that cost him anything at all, and it was not rest. 2 miles off base, in a house with a porch that faced west toward the flight path, Alma Kirkendall turned on the porch light at 5:40 every evening, whether Floyd's shift ended early or ran long, because the not knowing when he'd be home had never once stopped her from being ready for him. 49 years she had done this. She kept a small alterations business out of the front room, pins in a magnetic dish, a chalk wheel worn to a nub, and she never asked him what happened at the base, because in 49 years he had told her everything he needed her to carry, and nothing more. When his truck turned onto their road, the light was always already burning, gold and steady, a small, unspectacular fact that neither of them had ever once discussed, and neither of them had ever once missed. He did not think of the shed door as a burden while he mopped the terminal floor that week, and if he thought of it at all, it was only as a thing that would still be there tomorrow, the way it had been there every evening for 6 years, waiting on a hand that was, as far as the base's records were concerned, unauthorized to touch it. Northcott had earned her rank the hard way, and the crisis 2 days before the ceremony proved it. The catering contractor for the dignitaries' luncheon called in at 11 that morning to say their truck had blown a transmission 40 miles out and would not make the 4 o'clock cutoff, which left a base commander's office expecting linen service catering for a 3-star general's party with 5 hours and no vendor. Northcott did not raise her voice on that call either. She pulled the base's approved vendor list, cross-referenced delivery radius against remaining daylight, called 3 backup caterers in under 6 minutes, negotiated a split order between 2 of them to cover the shortfall, and had a revised timeline typed and distributed to 4 departments before noon. It was, by any measure that mattered to the people above her, clean work, done under real pressure, without a wasted motion. She did not gloat about it. She simply moved to the next item on the list, because that was what competence looked like from the inside, invisible unless you'd seen what almost went wrong. The next item on the list was the perimeter walkway. She found Floyd there at 1:30. Mop leaned against the fence rail, wiping down a handrail the dignitaries would touch during their final walkthrough. She checked her clipboard against the badge log, found no entry under Kirkendall in any tier, yellow, green, or otherwise, and felt the small, familiar tightening of a schedule, about to be threatened by an unlisted variable. "You're going to need to clear this section," she said. "General's walkthrough starts in 90 minutes, and facilities contract staff aren't badged for yellow line during a dignitary pass." "I've cleaned this rail every week for 6 years," Floyd said. It was not an argument. It came out flat. An observation offered and set down, the way a man sets down a tool he is finished with. "That's not a clearance tier," Northcott said. "That's a habit." She said it without cruelty, the way she might correct a form filled in the wrong column, and she did not wait to see how the words landed before turning to Jurgen, who stood a few feet off, holding a roll of caution tape. "Get him moved to the green zone before the general's car comes through that gate." Jurgen looked at Floyd, then at the tape in his own hands, and did not move as quickly as the order deserved. "He's not in the way, Captain. He's not on the list, Jurgen." She did not raise her voice this time either. That, more than anything, was what made it land the way it did. No heat in it at all. Just the clean arithmetic of policy, applied evenly. The same policy she'd used 2 days before to save a luncheon, now used to move an old man off a walkway he had swept for longer than she had held a commission. Floyd wheeled his cart back the 8 feet she indicated, the wheels catching once on a seam in the tarmac, correcting themselves. He did not look at her the way a man looks at someone who has wronged him. He looked at the truss overhead instead, at the new steel gleaming under its fresh coat of gray primer, the way another man might glance at weather before deciding whether to bring a coat. "You'll want to check the north anchor plate before the general puts his weight on that span," he said, mild as a man commenting on the time. Northcott did not look up from her clipboard. It passed load certification in March. "I didn't ask when it passed," Floyd said. "I asked you to look at it." She did look up then, briefly, the way a person looks at a clock that has just struck an hour it shouldn't have. But the caterer's revised delivery schedule was already vibrating in her jacket pocket, and the general's advance team was due at the gate in 80 minutes, and there was no room on her list, that afternoon, for an unbadged contractor's opinion about a bridge that had already passed every test the air station's engineers knew how to run. She marked his cart's new position on her chart, initialed it, and moved to the next name on her page. Floyd went back to the rail. He did not mention the anchor plate again that day. He simply finished the section she'd left him, in the smaller square of tarmac she'd assigned him, and did not once look toward the shed at the far end of the flight line, though everyone who might have noticed was too busy with badges to notice that either. The next morning brought the first real gate. A civilian inspection crew arrived to walk the truss inspection zone with handheld scanners and a laminated run sheet, and when Floyd wheeled his cart toward the access ladder to empty a trash bin bolted near the base of the span, a young technician in a Merrow-Field vest put a hand up before he'd said a word. "Inspection zones closed to non-cleared personnel," the technician said, reading it off the sheet the way a man reads a weather report, without malice, without particular interest either. "You'll have to come back after." Floyd nodded once, set the bin down where it was, and left it. He did not argue the trash still needed emptying. He simply rerouted, the way water finds a lower course, without complaint about the detour. That afternoon, ahead of the general's motorcade rehearsal, base security ran a sweep of every service cart scheduled to be within 200 yards of the ceremony route, and Floyd's was searched along with the rest. Bucket tipped, mop handle checked for a hollow core, the small toolbox under the seat opened, and its contents laid out on a folding table. A security specialist barely older than Yurgen lifted the notch gauge out with 2 fingers, turned it once in the light, read the stamped initials without recognition, and set it back down among the rags and spray bottles as though it were a stray washer. "Clean," the specialist said, and Floyd collected his things without comment, though his hand rested a half-second longer than necessary on the gauge before it went back into his breast pocket. The last gate came when he asked, on his lunch break, whether the base records office might let him look at the old maintenance index for the North Span footbridge, just the shed's file, just to know what year the padlock had been put on. The clerk behind the counter, not unkind, simply overworked with ceremony paperwork stacked to her elbow, told him the archive wasn't open to contractor requests without a facilities sponsor, and that she couldn't make an exception this week of all weeks, and he said he understood, and he did not ask again. Jurgen watched all 3 refusals from various distances, and each time he built a theory, and each time he revised it. First, he decided the old man was simply proud, the way some old-timers got proud about being moved around, and that the bridge comment was just an old contractor's habit of talking shop, with no real weight behind it. By the 3rd refusal, watching Floyd's face stay as unbothered as a fence post through all of it, Jurgen began to suspect pride wasn't the right word for what he was watching at all. Pride made noise. This made none. "You really think there's something wrong with that anchor plate?" Jurgen asked him quietly, once the security specialist had moved off with his folding table. Floyd looked at the truss for a long moment before answering, weighing something Jurgen couldn't see. "I think the paint line's wrong," he said. "New coat goes on smooth, if the metal underneath is sound. Look at the seam, by the second cross brace. It's lying flatter than the steel it's covering. Jurgen looked. He saw primer, gray and even, catching the afternoon sun the same as every other foot of the span. He did not see what Floyd saw, and said so, and Floyd only nodded, as if that were the expected answer, and pushed his cart on toward the green zone without further comment. The walkthrough proper began at 4 the next afternoon, 5 days ahead of the ceremony, now down to 4, with Northcott leading a team of 2 structural inspectors and a facilities engineer across the span, while Floyd, cart parked at the green line boundary as instructed, worked a stripping mop along a stretch of walkway 40 feet off. The inspectors carried a handheld ultrasonic scanner, sweeping it in slow arcs across the welds at each joint, calling out readings that came back clean, 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 in the flat cadence of men reciting numbers they expected to be unremarkable. They reached the second cross brace, the one Floyd had named the day before, and the scanner read clean there too. "She's solid," the lead inspector said, tapping the readout. "Every joint's within tolerance." Floyd had not moved from his section of walkway, had not so much as lifted his head from the mop's steady stroke, but something in the angle of his stillness now was different from the stillness he'd worn all week, a held quality, like a man listening for a sound only he expected to hear. He set the mop against the rail. He walked, unhurried, to within 12 feet of the brace, close enough to see it and no closer, because the tape still marked his boundary and he had not once crossed a line all week. "There's a hairline separation on the underside of that weld," he said, "on the toe of the joint, not the face. Your scanner's reading the face because that's where you're aiming it. Gaps opening about 4/1000ths past what the design tolerance allows. It won't show up until someone puts real cyclic load through it, which is what a ribbon cutting and a few hundred families walking across it in one afternoon would do." The inspector turned, scanner still in hand, and looked at the old man in gray coveralls, standing behind a line of tape, mop water darkening the concrete at his feet. 4/1000ths, he repeated, the number sounding foreign, coming back out of his own mouth. From 12 feet. 4/1000ths, Floyd said again, no different in tone than the first time. "Check the toe, not the face." Northcott's own portable unit was slung across her shoulder, a secondary scanner she carried for spot verification, and she lifted it, now less out of belief than reflex, aimed it where Floyd had said, adjusted the angle downward toward the joint's underside instead of its visible face. The readout blinked, recalculated, and returned a figure that made the lead inspector go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with policy at all. The whole walkthrough team stood still on that span for a long moment, 5 people and 1 mop bucket, and a truss, suddenly not as solid as its paint line had promised, while a man in a janitor's coverall, who was not cleared for the yellow line, finished the sentence the machines had been unable to start. The lead inspector wanted Floyd's reading and writing within the hour, and that was where the trouble properly began, because Floyd had no form to put it on. He held no engineering license current with the state, no facilities credential, no name in the base's contractor file beyond janitorial services, and a verbal call from an unbadged mop pusher, however precisely worded, was not admissible against a scheduled reopening with a 3-star general's remarks already sent to the printer. Northcott said as much to her own facilities director within the hour, not unkindly, simply as fact. They could not halt a ceremony on a hunch from a man with no standing to file a report, no matter how the number on her own scanner had landed. "Then get him standing," the director said, which solved nothing, because standing was not a thing granted on 4 days' notice. Northcott pulled the reopening file that evening to see what paperwork existed to weigh against Floyd's claim, and what she found unsettled the ground under her own certainty in a smaller, colder way than the weld reading had. The current truss's certification cited, as precedent for the anchor point's design load, a structural sign-off on the original north span footbridge dated 30 years back, signed by a Colonel Foster Nunnally, then base commander, attesting the original span's anchor point's sound and cleared for continued service. The new truss had been built directly atop those same anchor points to save cost and schedule. If the old sign-off was accurate, the new work stood on solid ground. If it wasn't, 4 decades of paperwork had been quietly resting on a lie Nobody currently on base had reason to suspect. That old bridge was condemned, Floyd told her, when she found him at the end of his shift and asked, flatly, whether he had any memory of it. I condemned it myself, wrote it up, handed it to Nunnally's office personally. Man told me he'd handle the filing. He said this the way he said everything, without heat, a fact laid on a table rather than a grievance aired. Whatever's in that file with his name on it isn't what I wrote. You understand what you're telling me, Northcott said. You're telling me a colonel forged a safety sign-off. I'm telling you what I wrote and what I handed him, Floyd said. What happened after it left my hand, I can't swear to. I can only swear to what I saw with my own eyes and measured with my own gauge. Northcott sent Jürgen to the records office that same evening to pull the archive box referenced in the old file's citation number, hoping to settle it with paper rather than memory, and that was where the second complication landed. The box existed, filed under a designation neither of them recognized. F. Kirkendall was nowhere in the index, only a call sign, Anvil 6, scrawled on the box's original intake card in handwriting 30 years faded. Before Jürgen could get authorization to open it, the records clerk flagged the box's retrieval in the system, which triggered an automated notice. The box sat in a records tier scheduled for routine destruction under a base-wide document purge timed, with no malice at all, to clear storage before the heritage ceremony's paperwork came in. 3 days. That was what remained before Anvil 6's box, whatever it held, went into a shredder queue with 400 other boxes nobody had looked at in decades. Jürgen stood in the archive stacks with the flag notice in his hand and understood, for the first time since he'd watched Floyd wheel his cart 6 feet to the left without a word of protest, that the old man's silence all week had not been the silence of a man with nothing to say. It had been the silence of a man who had already said everything that mattered 30 years ago to someone who had chosen not to listen. Northcott spent the better part of the next morning proving her own instrument right, about a fact that no longer mattered as much as she'd assumed it did. She walked the span herself with a full diagnostic kit, checked every weld the current inspection protocol specified, and confirmed what her scanner had told her the day before. Every joint currently on the certification checklist read within tolerance. Her software had not lied to her. It had simply never been asked the right question, because the anchor points beneath the new truss predated every calibration standard her equipment was built to measure against. She could scan the steel above the ground 100 times and never once look at what was poured into it 3 decades before her scanner existed. It's not that your reading was wrong, Floyd told her when she found him at mid-morning, and admitted as much, plainer than she'd expected herself to be. It's that you were only ever asked to check what's there. Nobody asked your machine to check for what was left out. She did not have an answer for that, and did not try to invent one. It was into that uneasy quiet that General Marion Rutherford's car came through the gate 2 days ahead of his scheduled arrival, unannounced to anyone below the installation commander, because he had wanted, he told his aide, to walk the span once without an audience before he stood on it in front of cameras. He crossed the yellow line without a badge check, because no one below him carried the authority to stop a 3-star general from walking wherever he pleased, and he found, 40 feet down the walkway, an old man in gray coveralls wiping down a handrail with the same unhurried economy he'd apparently used all week. Rutherford stopped walking. He stood there long enough that his aide, a few paces behind, began to wonder if something was wrong. Anvil 6, Rutherford said, quiet, almost to himself, the designation coming out of some drawer in his memory that had not been opened in 45 years. Floyd straightened, turning his whole trunk the way he always did, rather than lifting the bad shoulder, and looked at the general the way a man looks at weather he recognizes from a long way off. He said nothing. He did not need to. The silence between them did the introducing that words would only have slowed. Northcott, arriving at a run from the staging tent once word reached her that the general had breached the perimeter early, stopped short at the sight of a 3-star officer standing motionless in front of her unbadged janitor, and understood, before either man spoke another word, that whatever policy she had been enforcing all week had just been quietly and entirely overruled by history. What surfaced in the next hour told in pieces between the two old men on a walkway. Neither of them seemed in any hurry to leave. Was this 45 years ago, in a unit assessing bridge crossings under Rutherford's own young lieutenant's command. A 19-year veteran combat engineer named Floyd Kirkendall had called a river crossing unsafe against Rutherford's judgment, had been overruled, and had been proven right within the hour when the original crossing gave way under half the load Rutherford had ordered across it. No one had died, that was the whole of the debt, and it was not small for being bloodless. Rutherford had carried that overruled call for 45 years, the way some men carry a stone in a coat pocket, worn smooth by handling, never once set down. And 30 years after that river, a colonel named Foster Nunnally, who had trained Rutherford as a young captain, who had shaped the very engineering judgment Rutherford still carried into every command decision since, had taken Floyd Kirkendall's condemned assessment of the original North Span footbridge, buried it, and forged a passing sign-off in its place to protect a funding announcement timed for an election season 3 decades gone. The mentor who had made Rutherford the officer he became was the same man who had erased the truth Floyd had tried to hand him. The vindication and the reckoning, Rutherford understood standing on that span, were going to be the same piece of paper. Rutherford did not salute. He did not say the sentence every subordinate on that walkway half expected him to say. Instead, he recited low and exact, word for word, the structural call Floyd had made on that river crossing 45 years before, the load figures, the crossing angle, the exact phrase Floyd had used to describe the failure point, a recitation so precise it could only have come from a man who had turned those words over in his mind 10,000 times since, the way another man turns over a debt he intends to pay in full someday, whenever the day finally arrives that lets him. "You've carried that 30 seconds a long time, sir," Floyd said, when the general finished. 45 years, Rutherford said. "I was wrong once, and it should have cost men their lives, and it cost nothing because you were right instead. I have never once in 4 decades of rank been able to repay that." He looked past Floyd, toward the shed at the far end of the flight line, its padlock rusted the color of dried blood. "And now I find out, the man who trained me spent his career burying the only other time you were right." Floyd's testimony, when it came, ran short, plain, and complete, the way everything he said ran. He told them he had condemned the original North Span footbridge because the anchor points showed a shear crack he'd traced with the same gauge, riding in his pocket now, that he had written it up and handed it to Colonel Nunnally, personally, that Nunnally had told him he'd handle the filing, and that when the bridge reopened weeks later under Nunnally's own signature instead, Floyd understood exactly what had happened, and understood, just as clearly, that a 19-year enlisted engineer's word would carry nowhere against a base commander's, not then. He had gone home that year and told no one but Alma. He had carried the knowledge the way a man carries a key to a door that no longer opens anything, useless for its original purpose, kept anyway, because throwing it away felt like agreeing the room behind it never existed. "That's why the shed," Jurgen said quietly, understanding arriving in him all at once, the way water finally breaks through a dam it's been testing for years. "That's what's behind that door. Your report. My report and every tool I used to write it," Floyd said. "Filed under my own name once. Somebody's paperwork erased the name later. The shed's the only place on this whole base where what I know is still true, whether or not anyone else remembers it." He wasn't guarding a bridge. He was keeping a promise he made to men who never got to cross it. Northcott stood with that for a long moment, then did the one thing available to her that carried any weight at all. She pulled her own laptop from her bag, opened the reopening compliance file under her own login, and began entering, under her own name and her own signature authority. A formal correction to the certification record, Floyd Kirkendall's original condemnation, the anchor point flaw, the falsified sign-off, and her own scanner readings from that morning, all of it, staked to her career rather than buried the way it had been buried once before. "I could lose the ceremony over this," she said, not looking up from the screen. "I could lose more than that." "You'll lose less than you think," Floyd said, "and you'll keep something you can't buy back if you don't do it." When she asked him, Once the file was filed, what he wanted in return: name cleared, credit given, a line in the general's remarks. He shook his head slowly, the motion costing him nothing in that shoulder, because it required no reach at all. "Fix the anchor point," he said. "Quiet. Don't put my name on a program. Just make sure nobody's grandchildren walk across a lie." The North Span footbridge closed for 6 additional weeks past its original reopening date, a fact that made exactly 1 line in the base circular and no line at all in any newspaper beyond a county paper's back page, noting a minor scheduling delay due to routine maintenance. The anchor points were re-poured to current standard, the old flawed concrete broken out and hauled off in a truck that drew no more attention than any other. General Rutherford's remarks, when the ceremony was finally rescheduled, ran 4 minutes shorter than originally printed, with no mention of colonels, forged signatures, or 30-year-old paperwork. The correction lived where Floyd had asked it to live, in a filed compliance amendment under Captain Northcott's signature, quietly folded into a record that would outlast anyone's memory of the week it was written. Colonel Foster Nunnally's name was never spoken publicly in connection with any of it. Somewhere off base, in a house that had nothing to do with Merrow Field anymore, an old man who had once bet a bridge against a budget announcement lived out his retirement, never knowing that the ground had finally caught up with the paper. On the morning of the small rededication, 6 weeks after the walkthrough that had stopped an inspection team cold, General Rutherford arrived at the North Span footbridge ahead of the handful of base families and officers gathered for a ceremony with no press credentials in attendance at all. He walked to the maintenance shed first, where a locksmith had cut the old padlock free 3 days earlier at Northcott's order, the rust flaking away in the man's gloved hand, like something shedding a skin it no longer needed. Rutherford opened the shed's door himself, stepped back, and held it for Floyd Kirkendall to walk through first, the way a younger man holds a door for someone he has decided, once and for all, outranks him. Inside, on a shelf gone gray with 30 years of undisturbed dust, sat a single filing box marked Anvil 6, its condemnation report intact, Floyd's original signature legible beneath a layer of grime, a damp cloth lifted away in under a minute. Floyd asked for nothing more than that box's contents to be added to the official record, and Northcott, standing at his shoulder that morning in a role no longer defined by any badge tier, had already seen to it. The bridge itself reopened without fanfare on a Tuesday, families crossing it in 1s and 2s, none of them aware that the steel beneath their feet had ever carried a name other than the one currently stamped on its dedication plaque. Beside that plaque, mounted in a small glass case the base facilities office had commissioned without being asked twice, sat a hand-filed notch gauge, its stamped initials turned to face outward where any passerby could read them, F.A.K., worn smooth by 60 years of a single thumb's checking, laid to rest now, with nothing left to measure. Floyd's cart stood parked, empty, at the same spot on the tarmac where it had stood every evening for 6 years, 8 feet short of a shed whose door no longer needed his hand against it to remain true. He looked at it a moment longer than usual before he wheeled away toward the gate, though there was nothing left inside that shed now that required his checking. Some records get corrected only when the right hand finally reaches for the right door. 2 miles off base, the porch light was already burning gold against the early dark by the time his truck turned onto the road, the way it had burned every evening for 49 years, waiting on nothing but him.